All right, welcome to a Terror House Radio episode number 55. I'm Matt Forney, your charming and loquacious host, and the founder and editor-in-chief of Terror House Press. We are back for another live episode. This horrible experiment continues. My usual co-host and the producer of the show, Bryden Proctor, is still out. He's off enjoying his sojourn in the Peruvian jungles. My guest co-host for this episode is Benjamin Welton. He is an author, frequent contributor to Terror House Magazine, and the author of Sick Inside the Citadel and Panic, both of which you can buy from Terror House Press. And Panic is also available in audiobook format. And he's got a bunch of other great projects in the pipeline. Ben, thanks for coming on. How you doing?
Good, doing well. A little rainy where I'm at, but no complaints. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing good. You know, I was just talking off air about how I've only got 2 hours of sleep last night because my landlord is helpfully doing renovations on the unit upstairs at midnight, and at the moment my job requires me to be up at 5:30 in the morning. So you know it's but I'm wired on stimulants. I think I can make it through this. And our guest for this program is Ralph Monday. He is a English professor, poet, author, and most importantly, he's the author of Bergman's Island and Other Poems, which will be published by Terror House Press tomorrow. Ralph, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so I always start off first-time interview guests with this segment just because I don't want to put words in their mouth. So, Ralph, for the people in the audience who don't know who you are, could you just give a brief overview of yourself, your work, that kind of thing?
Okay, well, I'm originally from Appalachia, America's third world. I teach at Rome State Community College in Harriman. I'm a full professor there in the humanities department. I've been there since 1985. I've been writing poetry going all the way back to my high school years. I've always loved poetry more than the other format because I think that poetry says what can't be said any other way. I consider it like the ancients did, the supreme art form. If it's done well. Sometimes I don't know if I do it all that well, but I sure try. I live here in Harriman, Tennessee. Got a bunch of cats and dogs, and work on wine all the time.
Huh, yeah, it sounds interesting that you're an English professor. I mean, I'm interested in that experience just because you're. I wouldn't say your views don't exactly fall within the typical purview of what you would expect a professor to be in this day and age.
Are you asking me what I think a typical professor would be in this day and age? Did I understand you correctly?
Well, I mean,
I think that would be a fun route to go down real quick. Yeah.
Okay. If you don't mind talking about it,
Well, no, I'm not talking about it at all. First of all, I will state up front that I'm not your typical college professor because I'm not left-wing at all. Never have been. I've always been too smart, personally, to be left-wing. The majority of the colleges and universities in the United States are primarily left-wing, and I think that's very unfortunate because we left behind teaching from the Enlightenment, from the values of the Enlightenment, which, the Enlightenment is one of the founding principles of the United States and the West in particular. We've left a lot of those values behind, especially in the search for, and I'll put it in quotation marks, truth. Because from an Enlightenment perspective, and this is what I try to teach my students, that truth can be anyone's truth, anyone's opinion on anything, but it has to be backed up with evidence. It has to be backed up with reality. It can't just be subjectivity like the romantics would do, wandering around the graveyard or whatever. So most professors are left-wing that it used to be. Matter of fact, I saw the transition myself because I got my undergraduate degree at the University of Tennessee in 1978. And at that time, it didn't matter what department you were in, humanities, the sciences, whatever. The majority of the professors taught from an Enlightenment perspective because that's the way they had been trained. All right. So then I went back just a few years after that in, I believe it was either 81 or 82 to begin work on my master's degree. And the older professors didn't realize what had happened, because that's really when postmodernism began to take over and dominate the universities and colleges in this country. And that was the late 70s and 80s, and I saw it happen. I was right there. All of a sudden, it was all about the fall and deconstructionism and subjectivity and relativism and all of these other things that had absolutely nothing to do with, in my opinion, truth whatsoever. But instead, it was the beginning of a long indoctrination process that's occurred in the West. I think even more strongly in the United States for the last two generations of Americans who've gone to college. So I'll take a different perspective than many of my colleagues do, I'm sure.
Well, I think that's interesting too. I don't know if Matt planned this, but I think there's an interesting synchronicity here. Matt, you damn genius, you. Because I also went through the English graduate school program, and I also happen to be from Appalachia as well. Weird, right?
Yeah.
It does seem like, so when I went through master's program, obviously many years after you, I was kind of shocked by, I feel like most people get into English programs or just do literature because they love reading and something speaks to them about, whether it's poetry, novels, or whatnot. And then you get into the graduate program and all you read is continental theory. It's not even Anglo, English or American theory. It's all French writers translated, the occasional German writer. But it's mainly, it's the postmodernist Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, all these type of guys. And that was a big turnoff for me, not because I instinctively hate those guys, although I grew to dislike them intensely. But like, what I would read these guys and be like, what does this have to do anything with basic mechanics of a story? This is, we're getting way ahead of we're putting the, I hate to rely on an old standby, but the cart before the horse. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of students who don't even have a firm grip on the classics, and now we're getting into this hyper theoretical space with writers who aren't even English. That wasn't their specialty. Like, for instance, Foucault was a historian. So why are we reading him in an English department? So that was a long-winded way to ask, for me to ask you, is do you think, this is something I've always wondered, do you think that postmodernism gripped American schools so much because there is this, it's both an inferiority complex with American schools that they're always trying to ape what they consider to be the better European modes, or do you think there was some other cause? Because I always felt that there was this weird inferiority complex. A lot of my American English teachers, they talked about the Sorbonne as if it was the greatest thing ever, and they're trying to bring this kind of continental philosophy into English departments.
Now, that's a really interesting angle. I've never heard someone express it that way before. That may be a factor, but from the time that I've spent studying this, and I've spent a lot of time studying postmodernism because I think it's one of the worst things, probably the worst thing that happened to the Western world on a large variety of platforms. But for me, if you really want to see the very root of postmodernism, it begins with the French Revolution and with Rousseau in particular, because Rousseau is the first individual on mass platform to introduce the idea of subjectivity into discourse and attack completely the Enlightenment objectivity. So Rousseau in many ways is primarily responsible for the French Revolution, and then it goes on through various different German philosophers, in particular with this stream of thought, quite a few of them. And then I think what happened in the stream is that we get to the 1960s and the counterculture revolutionary movement, sex, drugs, rock and roll, hippies, whatever you want to call it all, which was very much a minority of individuals that were trying to create this Marxian utopia, right? That never happened. They were trying to create this Marxian socialism. It's a lot more complicated than this. There are other people involved, a lot of them. Create this Marxian socialism, this utopia, and it failed. So they were very, very disappointed. And so what did they do? Well, sometime in the middle 60s, late 60s, they went into the colleges and universities by the thousands in the United States and began to get doctoral degrees.
Mm-hmm.
From there, they went into the university starting in the late 70s, early 1980s, and we've had that influence of this thought process completely dominates the university now.
Mm-hmm.
From that point forward, they've also begun to teach the teachers, right? So
Right. Yeah.
it's filtered down into the public schools as well. And so we've got to a point now where we have so many people in this country who do not even understand what reason means. And you can't have a conversation with these individuals because it's useless. When I talk about people that are left-wing, I always do two things. I hold up two fingers, and I say there are only two things that you need to know, and that is honesty and subjectivity. That explains the whole mind for me. And it's a complicated thing. It's been much for a long, long time. Maybe there's part of the community. I don't know. I find a lot of higher education to be pretentious at times, and I don't like pretension at all. So what I try to do is teach my students and make them aware of what the country used to be, what the West used to be, like you mentioned the classics, that you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you read Homer, you read Plato, you read Shakespeare, you read Dante, you read all of these individuals for a reason, and the reason is this, that these are some examples of the greatest literature the human race has ever produced. And a reason why they're great is because they talk about the universal human condition that applies to any person, at any time, and any space, which postmodernism does not do at all. Postmodernism is nothing but pure politics. Everything is postmodernism. Coke can, whatever. I mean, it's insanity. It really
Sorry, I couldn't agree more. And it's funny that it does seem that so much of the theoretical rot can be tied back to France, whether it's revolutionary France in the 18th century, or it's the sort of new revolutionary France of the 1960s, because a lot of the postmodern thinkers that unfortunate grad students have to read, I mean, they're based in these French writers of the 60s and 70s. So I've always thought about my refutation of them is actually I got it from another French writer, Raymond Aron, who basically talks about Marxism is the opiate of the intellectuals. Because the sort of, whether it's capitalism or any other sort of system other than Marxism, basically often intellectuals are rendered superfluous, right? Wouldn't you agree? I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why they have this sort of attraction to these more totalitarian systems, is because in somewhat more sort of centralized systems, there really isn't. There's always room for intellectuals, but there's no power unless you have some sort of government underwriting that. Like, for instance, I always joke that I think every professor in the United States would have loved to have been in Wisconsin during Bob Lafayette, because he literally wrote his economic policies by going, "Hey, professors at Wisconsin, what do you think about this?" So it's this desire for power is kind of what drives this. I will note that I don't know if Matt, or if you've seen this, Mr. Monday, is recently, and by recently I mean within the last 5 or 6, 7 years, a lot of the heavyweights of the postmodern theory have been taken down. So, for instance, was it Paul de Man? Like, they found out a few years ago that he was a Nazi collaborator.
Right.
They're in the process of canceling Foucault now.
Foucault, because he was essentially a pedophile rapist.
He went to Tunisia to rape little boys, which is shocking.
Which is hilarious, because I've always been on sort of the fringe, crazy right-wing guy, right? That shouldn't be surprising to anyone who knew anything about Foucault. I mean, the guy was a complete degenerate. And I don't use that word in the sort of meme internet sense. I mean in the very literal criminal sense. So, but my worry is, because the first instinct is to revel in this, right? It's like they finally getting their comeuppance. But I worry is, like, what if it's almost like somehow these guys on a theoretical basis aren't radical enough anymore, so they're getting rid of them. Am I paranoid in that respect?
Now that's interesting. Not radical enough anymore.
Right.
I don't know, but I do know that if you look at the history of how postmodernism developed, as I was talking a little bit ago, that the postmodernists, like all leftists, will completely throw someone under the bus when that individual serves
Yeah,
their
absolutely.
They won't support them at all.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as far as radicalization, probably, because you see it now in the politics of the left, where everything is gender based or whatever you want to
Race
call it.
based.
Right?
Yeah.
I've always said that that race, class, and gender is the trinity of the left, because that's the religion really, and what they do, and maybe this is part of the radicalization that we're talking about. The left lies about everything that it does and says, and it does exactly the opposite. For example, the left always talks about unifying and bringing people together, right? And no, what does it do? It splits people apart into splinter groups, right? It splits people apart by gender, by race, by whatever sexual orientation, whatever it may be. There's no homogenous unity there at all. It keeps everything boiling all the time. And I sometimes wonder, okay, what's the ultimate purpose of keeping everything boiling? Is it to finally bring in this utopian Marxist revolution that the proletariat's going to rise up and just take over everything? Or is it moving now into the government itself, where the government's going to eventually crack down on all of this, with some of that starting now, isn't it, with mask mandates and political correctness and the lack of freedom of speech and so forth? So I really don't know. It's really complex. It's not simple.
True. Also, we could also be giving them too much credit. I mean, they could just be stupid, right?
That's
so
right.
maybe one of the reasons why Foucault and de Man are getting canceled is simply because they're dead European men, right? Maybe it really is just that basic.
I mean, it's the Cthulhu always swims left.
Right.
Today's radicals are tomorrow's reactionaries. Which is funny because Foucault, I think you mentioned this on Twitter, Ralph. Foucault really helped, build a lot of the philosophical underpinnings of what's going on today. I mean, one minor example is am I the only person who thought it was weird that like Black Lives Matter protesters, they use the phrase "Black bodies matter," stop harming Black bodies, which is weird because a human being is more than a body. We are more than than the flesh that and the bones that comprise us. Well, that comes from Foucault. It comes from his concept of biopower and the idea that society is about controlling the body. Foucault talked about how prisoners are the ultimate example of this because they're incarcerated and the state has total control over them. Black bodies matter is just that filtering down to the general population.
That's true. Foucault also stated one time, I'm paraphrasing, that a prison is the truest form of humanity, or something of that nature. I'm pretty sure that he did, which I never understood. I'll give you another example too of this whole thing that I think Matt is talking about in regards to rhetoric, calling harming the body, right? And it's controlling the language, because if you control the language, you begin to control people. We see that all the time, right? Twitter, everywhere else. But I remember when I was in the master's program at UT and being introduced to deconstructionists, to call them Derrida, Strauss, the others. And the professor was going on about how the deconstructionists talk about that no text is authentic, that no text is giving any sort of authentic portrayal of the world or people or anything else, right? None of it. So you couldn't trust any of the text. So I raised my hand and I was very simply asked a very logical and simple question. And I said, following your logic, that would apply to the text of the deconstructionist, right? And he didn't have an answer, because he was caught in an oxymoronic circle of contradiction. Because it's true. If no text is authentic, and that includes the deconstructionist text as well, and everything they say has to.
Which, by extension, that goes into no speech, no thought, no action or authentic.
Right.
Everything is performative, which, again, I think is actually more honest than they think, but it's only honest when they say it because, one of my favorite stories about the postmodernists, and I forget where I read it, so even if it's apocryphal, I apologize, but it's the leaders of the Khmer Rouge. What their greatest sin was they took Sartre, and I probably just butchered his name, they took him literally. So they sat in on his classes in Paris, they visited him in Paris, and they took the existentialists and sort of the French communists at their word, and they put what they had been talking about into practice, when for the Western communists, this was always more of a performance, like an extended performance piece. But it was very real for the Khmer Rouge. So I think that is also getting to the bottom of it. They're saying these things to shock you. They're saying these things to be feely softs and to show you how intelligent they are. But it is, by itself, a performance. But it's still dangerous because majority of people take them literally.
That's right.
Yeah.
I agree with that point. It's now because, as I said earlier, we've had 3 generations of Americans in the colleges and universities that have been trained in this river, and they don't know how to think at all. They don't know how to examine an argument for support and evidence. They have no idea how to do analysis of positions that are put in front of them. I talk about this in classes all the time, constantly. Like, for example, right, this whole attack on the Western canon. Well, that whole attack on the Western canon it's linked into lots of other things that have been going on. But one of the reasons it's linked in is envy. I fully believe that, because the Western canon, for the most part, there are some exceptions, for the most part, has been built by old white men, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Shakespeare, any number of ones that we want to mention. And old white men that's what's attacked in complete force by the left. So I think part of it is envy. I really do. And it's also an attack on trying to bring down the very foundations of Western civilization, not just from a literary standpoint, but from the whole idea of exceptionalism, that people can go out and do exceptional things, which we see a pattern of that in the Western world. I mean, when you look at the history of the Western world, it's, love it or hate it, whatever you want to call it, you can't logically deny that it's been built primarily by Europeans. And it has. That's just a fact of history. That's another reason why history is a fact. We want to erase history so that people don't know the truth anymore, except the truth that we tell you from a postmodern standpoint, and now we're going to rebuild you in the world in our image. That's going on right now. What's going on right now? Constantly.
Well, there's also, I've noticed, a sort of a centering in terms of history of exceptions as the rule, right? So one of the most ironic things I ever saw was a YouTube video of a basic YouTube guy decrying the fact that The Last Samurai, that Tom Cruise movie, I don't remember if I liked it or not, but they're like, oh, this is so ridiculous. Why is this movie about a white man that goes to Japan? Instead, they should have done this movie about this one African guy that shipwrecked in Japan. Like, that's more interesting. I remember thinking about it, watching that, going, well, you're mad at the Tom Cruise movie because it's the one exception to the rule, so you should replace it with the one exception to the rule, but except that the colors are reversed.
Yeah.
Again, it's there's no logic here. It's really emotionally driven. So I quit trying to logic with it and just sort of embrace the fact that it's well-dressed nihilism. It's what it really is.
Yep. When you don't believe in it, if you don't believe in anything, then it doesn't matter if the whole world comes tumbling down. That's fine.
Right.
For you, completely. And when you mention the idea of emotionalism, see, that goes all the way back to the French Revolution and Romanticism. Mm-hmm. And very roots are there, right there with Rousseau, and everything is about emotion and subjectivity and feeling. The 18th century German philosophers, Heidegger and others, also picked up on Rousseau and developed that theme all the way through until we get to the 1960s. And the 1960s is just the French Revolution, a little over 100 years later again, on technological steroids and drugs. It is. It's the French Revolution in a way all over again. And we've got all of these individuals. I mean, good old Bernie's a perfect example of a burnout hippie. Never done a thing in his life except get paid by the government. And he's an individual that wants to bring this Marxist utopia to the world. It's not going to happen. No, socialism never will. Never has. Never will.
Well, I mean, Robert Ringer once wrote that if you deny reality, it automatically works against you, which is something you see on a long enough time scale that plays out. Maybe not in the next week or so or month, but what we're seeing right now isn't going to. It's not going to last. I mean, there are a lot of people who are like really depressed over what's happened in the past few months. Things that in the past year, things that due to a certain terms of service regulation, I'm not allowed to specify what that is, but I'm sure you all can figure out what I'm talking about. But keep the faith is what I would say with regards to what's going on, and also keep things in perspective. Like, anyone is a scholar of say, what happened and during the Soviet Union and communist era. So like, we're not at that point yet. We could get to that point, but for the most part, things are pretty good for most of us right now. I mean, I'm grateful for the fact that I've got a roof over my head and I get to make a living in part, having conversations like this and publishing great books like Bergman's Island and Other Poems, which is out tomorrow by a guy named Ralph Monday. So I'd say that. And another thing too, I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the show. If you have questions for Ralph, Ben, or myself, you can send a Streamlabs tip to streamlabs.com/terrorhousemagazine. We'll read those out later in the show. And as an extra incentive for those of you in the chat, Ben is going to get half of all of the tips that are sent in. So send in some money, and he'll get some money.
Why? Wait a minute. Why am I getting? What the hell's going on here?
Because you're the co-host. I thought you
were saying I'm like popular or something. It's ridiculous.
No. I split the proceeds with Bryden when he's doing the show. I split it with Eris when she was co-hosting the last show. Definitely. Oh yeah, and a shout out to Bryden. He's in the chat. Nice to see you're doing okay, pal.
Yeah. I don't know if okay is the right word. Bryden and I are currently in talks to create a story, and Bryden is a fellow West Virginian, and his fatalism even bothers me.
So what you're saying is I'm outnumbered here?
Oh God, yeah. Go you damn Yankee. What are you doing talking to us? Syracusan? Is that the term, Syracusan? Is that what people from Syracuse are called?
Yeah. The term isn't used much in spoken English. Usually the term is fucking sad sack.
Orange juice?
That's funny.
Want to be Buffalo, maybe?
Going back to what Matt said just a moment ago about don't give up, don't get into despair. I agree with Matt. I think that we're in another cycle of history, and this too will eventually pass. People will get tired of the insanity, and we'll look once again for reason and logic. And if you just looked at the electoral map of the United States, of course, we really don't want to get into what happened with Trump. That's another story in and of itself, I'm sure. But it's primarily red all over the country. On the left coast and on the East Coast, which are all leftists. So the left tries to make us think that they are a majority, and they're not. They're very much a minority, but they're a dangerous minority because a minority with power is very, very dangerous.
I would echo that absolutely. The other thing I would too. I mean, I believe with you guys, I try to be positive as much as possible.
I agree.
However, decaying civilizations can last much longer than you'd think.
Yes, they can.
Athens, we tend to think of Athens, Golden Age Athens, but, there was a long period where, Athens still exists as a city-state, but it's essentially a vassalage of others, and it lasts. These things can last. Soviet Union lasts, 80 years? These things can last. I've always said that one of my predictions, and I may be a little hyperbolic, but I do think that at some point within the next couple of years, we will see I've declared, and I wrote an article about this, America's own version of the years of lead. So if you look back into what Italy went through in the 70s, where you had competing terror groups that were definitely funded by different governments. I mean, the idea that they were purely organic is silly. but this basically the strategy of tension where the different groups got involved to sort of delegitimize both the left and the right, and ultimately who comes up winning is the sort of the state. So further empowering the state. So I would not be surprised if we see that in the United States. And frankly, it's already happened in the United States. I mean, people forget how bad the 70s was in the United States in terms of left-wing violence, left-wing terrorism. I mean, there was like a bombing every other week at one point in American history. So the idea that we could go back to that is something I do foresee happening. The good news is, for people who are willing to wait it out, is that people do eventually get tired of instability. And there tends to be a reaction. Now, in America, the reaction was Reagan. I think this time it could be something much stronger. The one fear, though, I do have is that back then in the 80s, even in places like Italy, the sort of normal people were still, roughly speaking, the people in control of the government. Can't say that anymore. So I do worry that the radicals have overtaken the government, and not just the United States, all of the West. I mean, what's going on in Canada with like COVID camps, very worrisome.
I know.
So the idea that's my one concern, though. What normality can we go back to when those who are in charge of the levers of power are the 60s generation, is the people who are screaming fight the power? Well, they're the power now. So I don't know. That's why I'm going back to Appalachia, building my cabin and drinking my own water. I almost said pee there. Water.
I thought you were going to say moonshine.
But
hey, my grandfather, God bless him, Jake, long dead, had cancer for 10 years, tougher than nails. He did his own moonshine. He was also a backwoods mechanic, probably the worst backwoods mechanic ever, especially because he had a bad habit of losing the cars in poker games. But I'm just saying, it's in the blood. It's in the blood.
I'm not knocking it. I mean,
Great, hell of a life.
Like a long time ago, I went and visited my uncle down in Missouri, and he was. We went out hunting with some friends of his from Arkansas. My uncle's, my family's from New York, but my uncle had been stationed in Arkansas when he was in the Army, and he just loved that area so much he moved down there when he retired. And they were passing around the moonshine. They'd flavored it with cider and stuff, and it was a little protocol. Just take one sip because it's really strong stuff. So I took it when it was my turn. And I just took like a huge slug, and they all started laughing and be like, "You're going to be flat on the ground in like an hour." And I'm like, "That stuff tastes great, man. I don't know what you're talking about." And right on cue, about an hour later, I was stumbling around in the woods trying to find a place to pee without and could barely stand up. So I mean, they got me there.
It's
There's hair in your chest.
powerful stuff. Absolutely. Well, one thing that will happen eventually is all the baby boomers are going to die off, right? But what's going to come behind them? Are we going to have a backlash more to the right or not? The millennials, from my experience with millennials, they're either middle of the road to middle left, most of the ones I've encountered. Will that change as they get older? I hope so.
I mean, in the fourth turning, the millennials are supposed to be the hero generation in the cycle. I mean, I'm not sure how that's going to manifest.
You're right.
Again, it's sort of that built into that theory is the idea that it's always going to be a small sort of like core of them. It's not going to be the millennials as a whole.
Right.
I don't know. I agree with you in terms of millennials. I do think in a weird way the usually extreme leftism of the the youngest generation, Zoomers. I think it's weirdly calming the millennials because everyone was talking about how bad the millennials are, and I feel like the ones I've surrounded myself. I mean, I admittedly am a millennial. I think a lot of their knee-jerk leftism has been calmed down just because leftism is sort of it's a train with no brakes, right? It's just gonna keep going and going and going until it hits the wall. It'll rebuild itself in one form or the other, and then just keep going again. So I don't know. I will say though that the far right, as in terms of American parlance, of the baby boomer generation was, fringe libertarians, for lack of a better word. Right. The far right of millennials you're getting into much much more like reactionaries. There's the monarchist milieu online, guys like BAP and all these type of. So that's one thing that is different. I do think that you don't have this sort of. It's not John Birch. It's like something in a weird way. The more Europeanized the American left has become, the more Europeanized the American right has become in response. I don't know if you guys would agree with that.
No, I think that's an interesting point, and one of the reasons why is a lot of the millennials. I don't have percentages, but a lot of them have gone and lived in Europe for a while, and they brought back a lot of those cosmopolitan ideas with them. I mean, both my sons lived overseas and taught English as a second language.
Mm-hmm.
My oldest son, Logan, he was 1 year in South Korea, and then 2 years in Macedonia. And then my youngest son spent a year and a half in Beijing. So they have different views than I do. And
it's also the internet too. I mean, we have technology. The technology that we're having, that we're using, is one of the greatest disruptors, if not the greatest disruptor since the Industrial Revolution. So that's a big part of it. Although I will say, I don't know, Matt, this is something you agree with, that maybe this appeal of non-American ideology for Americans, especially millennial Americans, is basically the belief that they've given up on the American traditions because they don't see that they offer anything to change the dynamics of the culture, right?
You do see a lot of that with the extremely online right types who are always
extremely online. I mean, the A word should come up here, right?
Yeah. The people who are always quoting what's his face, Evola, and Evola. Francis Parker Yockey, who was technically American but had more in common with Europeans philosophers than American philosophers. I think that's part of it, and I do see the Americanization of the European right because I lived in Europe for 4 years, and I interacted with a lot of right-wing figures in Europe. I went to speak at a conference in Stockholm once, and a lot of the Swedes told me that they actually admired the American free market system as they interpreted it, just because. Everyone praises the Swedish, the Scandinavian social welfare system.
Right.
From their perspective, they didn't like it because it basically tamped down their ability to actually make a living. So they're taxed at something like 70% of their income. And there's really no opportunity for social advancement in a place like Sweden. If you're familiar with the concept of Jante law, I probably mispronounced that. Basically, the philosophy there is the tallest poppy gets the chop.
Right.
Everyone is kind of brought down to a level of equality, and if you try to rise above that, there are either structural societal structures that will keep you from doing so, or you'll just get the enmity of everyone that knows you. And they saw America as kind of a place where they wouldn't have those constraints. Which is kind of borne out by the fact that Sweden really hasn't. What's the most significant thing to come out of Sweden in the past 100 years? ABBA, IKEA.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Well, there's a great book, Matt and Mr. Monday, that I would recommend to both of you. It's actually a Swedish journalist, Katja Norman. It's called The Swedish Unimind, and it's all about how there's something uniquely Swedish. There's a unique style of Swedish conformity that you could actually probably apply to the Nordic people in general, like Norway, Denmark, but Sweden specifically. That the way Sweden developed, because Sweden not that long ago was a backwater in Europe. It was very rural, very poor. It was an extremely poor country, and the way it developed was always top down. There was never this ground up. It was a state enforced, and that's one of the reasons why the Swedish military in the 30 Years' War was so good, because it was a legitimate professional military fighting a bunch of glorified militias.
Right.
But the problem with that is Okay, Bryden is telling me to put headphones on, so here you go.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up. Yeah.
All right. So should I when I'm not talking, I'll just turn it off, okay? Because I don't have headphones.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Not that he's going to threaten me over it. I mean, he's more likely to threaten you over it. He's not coming to Mexico, but yeah, you were saying, Ben?
Oh, it's just that the thing about the trying to figure out how I can stop annoying Bryden, because I live my life according to what Bryden wants. Yeah, that's just the sort of the top-down sort of society is something very uniquely Nordic. I'm gonna go see if I can do something to cut down on the background noise. Tell me if it works, okay?
Okay. Well, I think it's a perfect opportunity to move on to talking about Bergman's Island and other poems. Since that's the topic of this show. Ralph, you wanna talk a bit about the book?
Well, the book was a long time in developing. It was various different poems that I'd written over a number of years. I think maybe the oldest one of them may go back to 2014 or 2015, something of that nature. And I never deliberately set out to write about any particular theme at all. I don't think that artists really do. As a matter of fact, sometimes I don't even know what it is I'm going to say until after I've said it. It's a strange process. It's like being a channel, I think, for the muses, and they actually flow through you, because sometimes I'll look at things and go, did I actually write that? So as I look back at the book and I reflect on it now, a lot of it, and Matt Lawrence, he really captured this.
Yes, you can see I put the cover image up on the screen so everyone can take a look at that fine cover art.
Beautiful painting that he did. I began to notice that my poetry was reflecting a desire to return to a different America than the one that I now inhabit. That the America that I was born into and that I grew up into, well into the, about the late 70s, early 80s, it's gone. It's gone, and it's not coming back. And from my perspective and my value system, and maybe nostalgia is just that. Maybe it's just remembering things that weren't really there at all. You'd like for them to be there. But many of the poems offer that nostalgia and trying to reclaim essentially a lost world. In a way, it has a type of connection, I think, to Eliot's The Wasteland. I mean, it's certainly nothing like Eliot's The Wasteland. But the idea in The Wasteland, like in much of this book, is that there's something in the world that we've lost, that we'd like to regain, but we can't. But that's also a characteristic of modernism, the modernists as well. And so I think that many of the poems deal with that nostalgia and deal with that world that once was that no longer is. And there's a melancholy tone to a lot of them. So that's basically, I think, how the book came into conception when I began to look at all these poems and started to assemble what I thought might be a book. I began to notice certain themes in quite a few of the poems that I've written that all seem to fit together, sort of like pieces of a puzzle. And I brought the book together that way, and I hope I did it successfully.
I'd say you definitely did a successful job of that, and yeah, the book is definitely steeped in nostalgia, and also from it's written from a more modernist perspective. You point this out in your introduction. You're not a fan of postmodernism due to the subjectivity and all that. And one of your influences is actually Wallace Stevens, who's one of my favorite poets. In fact, one of the last poems in the book is a takeoff of one of Stevens's poems.
Yeah, the Sunday Morning. And what I did with that poem was it was the 100th anniversary coming up of the publication of Sunday Morning, I believe back in 2014. So I decided to try my version of an homage to Stevens, and I constructed the poem the same way he did, basically, 8 stanzas, 15 lines each, written in blank verse, loose blank verse, which is what he did as well, of having the woman in the original poem from Stevens' Sunday Morning speaking from the grave and being asked questions now about life in the Western world 100 years later, and get into a conversation once again with this voice that comes into the poem, whether it's herself talking to herself like in the original. It doesn't matter, no one knows, but there's a dialogue going on between the two. And so I tried to write it as effectively as I could in honor of Stevens, because he is one of the great poets of all time. He may be the greatest of modernist poets. I know we get into apples and oranges now, but he's certainly one of them. So I did that, and it was originally published in Crack the Spine. When I first gave it to the editor there, she took it immediately, and I had one editor, publisher, John Horvath, I think has passed away. He called it a masterpiece.
I definitely liked it. Ben, have you worked on your audio situation, or?
Let's try. Is that better?
Definitely, yeah.
Oh, there you go. See, I don't want angry Bryden at me. I actually had a question about the first poem. Of course, everyone loves Wallace Stevens. Emperor of Ice Cream, one of my favorites. And Sunday Morning too is great. Every time I drive through Reading, Pennsylvania, I always think of him. Funny enough. The question I had for you is your very first poem, Lost German Girl. Did you know that there is, very minor. So I know exactly the video you're talking about.
Right.
I've actually watched it several times. There is one version of it on YouTube where there's some editing that went on. In the title, it says Lost SS Woman after Fall of Berlin or something. So in the title, the editor of the video is saying that this woman belongs to the SS. And if you actually read the comments, it's interesting. There are there's a couple people who say, oh, and this is actually a Czech woman. This is not a German woman. Some people say this is just a civilian. But there are a few comments who are like, oh, she's SS. I no longer feel bad for her. She got what she got what she deserved. So it's interesting that you talk about that, the sort of the basic humanity in poetry, and yet the one thing I think one of the nostalgia you might feel for the old America is that this more kind of hyper real United States, as you can give this example with this Lost German Girl, it's far less human and far less humane. And I definitely get that through Bergman's Island, that there is this sort of loss of, I hate to say it, but this sort of basic nobility in humanity that is gone, and we don't see it returning anytime. And that bleeds into the fact that, I'm going to say this, but I want people to prove me wrong, that no one reads poetry anymore, right? That's one of the refrains I've heard that no one reads anymore. Prove me wrong, everyone out there who's watching. Buy this book. Great cover, great stuff. But do you think that poetry has lost its edge? Obviously, or sorry, not its edge, its appeal, because it's gotten, for lack of a better term, most poetry, modern poetry, is masturbatory, right? It's people talking about themselves all day long and their problems, and that's Oprah. I don't need that in my life. But do you think that maybe poetry has kind of lost its appeal because we have entered a far less humane or human-centric society, despite this, equality, Black Lives Matter, Asian Lives Matter, all these, none of them are dealing with the fact that we've become far less human. We've almost all become sort of cyborgs because of just the march of technology.
Yeah, I think that's, I agree with you. I think that's one part of it, certainly. I think another part of it is it fits back with your comment about becoming technological cyborgs, is that my generation is probably the last great reading generation in America. Okay? I'm not saying that to blow my own horn. It's because we didn't have the technology. When I grew up, you had basic, the radio station, and you had 3 channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS, all in black and white, and they went off the air at midnight and played the national anthem. So that was the means of technological communication that one had. So the way that people really learned is they read all the time. Maybe they didn't read literature, but they read newspapers, right? They read periodicals, whatever it may be. So we switched from being a reading generation where we have to actively take in and process information, we have to think about it, to having all the information created for us and just washes over us. And so now it's hard work to read anything for people because people don't read as a whole. They get their fix by just sitting there and letting it just be poured over them. And this is what you should think. This is what you should see. This is what you should believe. right? So I think that's a huge part of what happened. There are always exceptions to any generation. There are still many people of the last two generations, I'm sure, who are avid readers. Well, we know they are because books are still being sold all the time. The thing with poetry, I think, that turned the reading public away from poetry, at least was a factor, is when poetry stopped being published in newspapers and some of the common outlets like Reader's Digest and so forth, or Saturday Evening Post, because all of those used to all the time have poems, and people read poetry as well. So it's a number of different factors, but certainly I think the major one is that people don't read anymore because they have so much of the information created for them. They don't have to work. It's easy. And when you don't have to work, you don't learn to think well.
I mean, that makes sense. This was studied, I think, about 10 years ago. It showed that Google basically induces a sort of brain damage, where it becomes more difficult to recall specific facts, but it becomes easier to recall where you can find the facts.
Right.
Like, here's a perfect example. Remember when, Ben and I think are old enough to remember this area. Remember when you had to memorize people's phone numbers? Like, you used to know your friend's phone number, your parents' phone number. Now, if, I vaguely recall my parents' phone number, but I don't even know my own phone number half the time. I have to go onto WhatsApp and look it up. That's an example of that. And there was also, I forget the name of the book on how technology was basically rewriting our minds, where you have access to so much information that it causes a sort of overload in the brain, and you just can't process it the way you used to. And also, there's just distractions everywhere. I was thinking about this in the context of music. I'm turning 33 in June, and when I was a teenager, that was when we first started to get stuff like iTunes, Napster, file sharing, etc. And you suddenly had access to this entire treasure trove of recorded music going back to the 40s and such. So you can pick and choose which songs, etc. You can listen to the same song over and over again. You're not limited by what you can physically buy in your area. Whereas I imagined, people buying music and before the internet would buy, they buy LPs. They listen to an entire album. It would be kind of more of an experience. Where here it's more of a, well, for me and for people younger than me, it's more of an impulse thing. Oh, I like this song. I'll listen to this song. Then I'll listen to this song from a completely different album. Then I'll torrent this song from an obscure band that their CDs are only minted in France or something. Just information overload that completely harms our ability to focus on anything and develop any kind of critical thinking or reading skills.
No, that's a really good point. I've got two things I'd like to say in reply to that. One of them I want to, and it fits in. I want to return back to the. I think it was Ben said this. Talking about poetry that's become sort of a personal vomit about, I heard, I believe, I'm thrown upon the thorns of life. Everybody needs to know this and hear me, right? Poetry, what you want to call poetry now with all those different journals that come out, it shifted away from the universal and goes into narcissistic self-whining. That's what many of these journals publish now. And so many of them are, quote, woke, that I don't even bother submitting poems to them anymore because I know they won't publish my stuff. First of all, they won't understand it. Second of all, they'll think that, I'm just some kind of, unwoke white guy trying to write this stuff. I mean, who writes the modern stuff anymore, right? Let's get with it. Let's be hip. Let's do all this other kinds of things about talking about how bad our own personal lives are. So postmodern poetry for in large part is narcissistic self-whining. And so it has nothing universal about it at all. Right? I mean, it's a type of bad confessionalism, like from Plath or Anne Sexton. It's really a very bad confessionalism. Whereas what I try to do, working on the modernist tradition, I'm not so concerned about my own life. I'm concerned about the human universal, and about how people deal with the human condition in various different ways at any point in history and time. And so my poems try to reflect this. I try to look at stuff that's going to connect to everyone at any point and anywhere, anytime, the universal human condition. And I think that poetry like that will last. 50 years, nobody's going to remember all of these woke journals. Nobody's going to remember all these poets that have published in them. It's one of the really things that I applaud Matt for doing, because Matt has gone completely against the grain from these journals. Matt looks for good material. Now, some of it is controversial because I think Matt likes controversial things, and that's fine.
I think it's a bit more light, but yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
And some of it's not, but he looks and continually delivers good quality material. I read every issue when it comes out, and I need to comment about people in there. But I think what Matt is doing in the platform that he has now, and I hope he continues with this, I really think he has a really good chance at doing something significant in the literary world. I really do.
I appreciate that.
He's already done something significant. He's convinced people that he's an editor. Sure. But to get back to Mr. Mundy, what you were saying is, this is something that's always bothered me, and I've gotten a little bit of a feeling for you, and I'm sure it bothers you as well. I think one of the other problems with how bad poetry has gotten is that the definition of what is poetry has been expanded so much that no one actually knows what poetry is. That it does have an internal logic, and it has schemes. Like, I'm not just going to say it's bad, but rap is not poetry. It is rap. It is a completely separate thing. Song lyrics are not poetry. They are something different. So I'm sure that probably bothers you too.
It does, very much so. Matter of fact, I remember when rap first came out, I think, what was it, middle 70s? Not middle 70s, I think.
In the later 70s, like 78, 79. Wasn't that I almost said the Winter Hill Gang, which was a Boston mob. But what was it, the Rapper's Delight? Weren't they like the gang something? Sugar Hill Gang.
Yeah, I think it's Snoop Dogg. He was right there at that time, right? Was Snoop Dogg right there at that time, I think? Maybe. But anyway, I remember when I first heard rap, and I turned to someone and said, "What is this? This stuff is crap. It'll never last." Boy, was I wrong. And we don't attempt anymore, and this is part of the egalitarianism. It goes back to you talking about the Swedish socialism earlier. It goes back to trying to make everything egalitarian, right? Right? Take away exceptionalism, make it all egalitarian. Well, when you do that, you don't have anything but a big bunch of mush that goes together in a pan, and nobody can distinguish anything anymore. But we've lost in many ways the idea of excellence in anything. And that you shouldn't strive for excellence. No, because if you're doing that, then who are you? What are you trying to be? Someone that's better than someone else? And you're not better than anyone else. So we don't like excellence any longer. I believe that's a huge part of it. And postmodernism, it went away from the universal human condition that we've been talking about to this personal narcissistic solipsism. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's what so many of these so-called writers do all the time. It's a type of narcissistic solipsism. Well, the world's not centered around any one human being at all. But a lot of people evidently think that. And they think that, like on Facebook, which I'm not on Facebook, I'm not going to be, never have been, never will be, is like what I ate for lunch 15 minutes ago is somehow universally important to everyone. Well, no, it's not. Who cares? I hope you had a nice lunch. But who cares? So we don't have, I think, in art, at least maybe there's a minority still working with this. We don't have people looking at trying to express what it means to be a human being, not color, right? Not race, not sex, not gender, whatever. What it means to be a human being thrown in to the forces of the world in any time and any place. That's what lasts. Because if you go and look back at the earliest work that we have, literary epic, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Sumerians, right? About 5,000 years ago. And when you look at Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh asks the very same questions then that we do now. How did I get here? Where am I going? What's my destiny if I have one? What happens to me after I die? Those are universal human questions. But people don't do that anymore. There's very little of it. And and like I don't even bother trying to submit to any of the big journals anymore. I've been in a couple of times uh, years ago, but like poetry, it's all woke. Tin House, it's all woke. The big so-called big top ones, they're all woke. They won't take anything of mine, so I don't even bother. It's a waste of time.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but did you just say Penthouse is woke?
Tin House.
Oh, I'm sorry. I almost doubled over laughing at the very thought of it. I know Playboy became woke, but Penthouse was the last bastion of freedom of speech.
I don't know. I haven't seen a Penthouse in many, many years.
Are they even made anymore? I'm sure it's just straight pornography now.
Well, I think they still run the fucking stories at least. There's probably more money in that just because it's, there's pictures of naked women everywhere, but like a good erotic yarn that's harder to find, But even this kind of goes back to like what Ralph mentioned with regards to poetry not being published in newspapers anymore. If you go back and flip to like a Playboy from like the 1960s or the 50s, they're far more literate than like literary journals of today. Like Playboy and Sports Illustrated and magazines like that, they published poems, they published short stories. Faulkner was published in Sports Illustrated. Shel Silverstein was published in Playboy. Even the more low rent kind of smut mags from that era would run short stories and like reviews of plays and stuff. You can kind of see the decline from that kind of material where, you would buy it for the, we all the joke, like I read it for the articles, but the articles weren't that bad,
No,
compared to what comes out today.
Absolutely. And that just goes to show you that the baseline, or what people assume to be the baseline of your average American in the 60s or 70s, was much higher than what is presumed now. We live in this weird ass backwards culture that I totally sympathize with Mr. Monday, because I've gone through this stuff too, where what are the elite gatekeeping institutions in the literary world are full of people who are themselves elite. Like the people who are writing poetry and publishing those mags, it doesn't take much of a rocket science to figure out what their resume is. They went to some really good school in the United States. Parents are probably, well-to-do. But so it's elite gatekeeping for the elite to therefore write work that is the lowest common denominator.
Exactly.
So we live in this really backward system where that's going on, whereas stuff like Terror House and more sort of, you could almost say, democratic forums, or in my opinion, and I'm saying this absolutely as somebody who gets published by Terror House, so I'm definitely blowing that trumpet there, Matt. Democratic form, but it's producing, I think, content and art and work that is on a much higher plane than stuff that used to be considered like, oh my God, I got published in this magazine. Well, today that I really don't feel like that means anything, because look what they're publishing. It's
exactly.
dross. It's crap.
It's all crap.
It's all crap.
It's interesting that you mentioned the stories too, or I think maybe it was Matt that said this about Playboy. A lot of the great science fiction writers like Harlan Ellison and Robert Silverberg, Asimov, many others, they published short stories in those magazines quite often.
Well, not only that, look at who was I think for the longest time, one of the Playboy editors in the fiction department was this sadly overlooked horror writer, Ray Russell, who wrote, Mr. Sardonicus and these excellent, well-crafted, very sort of Victorian Gothic short stories. And he had a great taste. I mean, you had everybody from, like you said, some of the great, science fiction writers to guys like Charles Beaumont, who was one of the premier writers for the Twilight Zone. He wrote great fiction. Ian Fleming. God, James Bond was in this. Who are they publishing now in Playboy? Like,
I don't know. I have no idea.
Honestly, who cares? Right?
Who cares? I mean, since Hefner gave it up, it all changed completely, and then he died.
It's true.
Yeah. Wonder why. So that's what I try to do, gentlemen. I try to appeal to the universal. I'm not a confessionist.
Actually, oh, sorry, Matt. I was going to say we actually have a question from the chat for for Ralph. If do you want to ask, or do you want me to take it?
I'll read it. Just
okay. Go ahead. Sorry,
okay.
I didn't mean to.
I would ordinarily make the asker, send us tip, but it's Bryden, so he gets a pass because he's on the staff. But he asks questions.
Spectrum.
Yeah. Bryden asks a question for Ralph. What makes you think art can last when we know everyone has their own version of history, like Japan versus America? Nothing can last, can it?
Well, if you want to talk about the laws of entropy and thermodynamics, I suppose not. But a lot of art has lasted. It's under attack in the Western world, and I'm speaking specifically of the Western world now. A lot of it has lasted, despite, say, in the universities, despite the turn away from the classics, such as Shakespeare and Plato and Homer and any number of others, Dante, that we could mention. Despite that attack on trying to relegate these individuals to basically nothing status, they still survive and they're still being read. And the works of Shakespeare are reproduced every year in record numbers. So there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that there are still individuals out there that recognize universal greatness. See, for me, for any piece of art to be great, it doesn't have to move me emotionally, though it can. But what it does have to do is address the universal human condition, because that's where we all come from. Go back to the story in Genesis, if you like. Adam and Eve, when they're born, that's like the birth process. They leave the paradise of the womb, and they're thrown into the field of time and space and into the field of human mortality, and they wake up at that time. And then we see this exhibited in the stories that follow from there as well. And the Bible has lasted and will continue to last, despite many people not being as religious as they used to be. It will. So that's what I would say in response to that.
I would also maybe ask you a little bit. I mean, I do agree with you, but just to play devil's advocate, it's interesting that Bryden brings up Japan, because one of the things I've noticed, I'm not a scholar of Eastern literature. I would never pretend to be. But the one thing I've noticed that it's nowhere near as universalizing as sort of what the Western canon seems to be. Now, again, this is as a novice. So my question to you is, maybe this goes back into sort of the problems with universalizing poetry, is the fact that that idea in itself is very Western, because, Western Christianity is a universal religion. That the idea of a human condition, this is something that's so unique to Western civilization that maybe the attack on it goes back to this idea you talked about, that, that basically that no one in the sort of woke believes in universality, because maybe they recognize, whether correctly or wrongly, that universalism is, in a way, either only in or so synonymous with Western civilization that there's no way you can detach it.
Well, of course. I mean, I'm definitely coming from that Western standpoint, because I'm born and raised in the West. My entire traditions are primarily Western. But to me, that doesn't matter. And I know very little about Eastern literature as well. I've read some Upanishads, things of that nature, in Hinduism, and some stuff here and there. But it doesn't matter if you're from Japan, or if you're from India, or if you're from Russia, or if you're from, I don't know, hills of Montana, whatever it may be. If there's something in that work that speaks to you as a human being in your life, then it's speaking to the universal. It's transcending time and space. It doesn't matter where you are on the globe. If there's something there that speaks to you as a human being, then it's universal. Always has been. Always will be. We see the emphasis on Western culture because, and you're right, Ben, the Western culture has been primarily dominant for, 2,500 years now, I guess. Probably about 2,500. We'll go all the way back to the Golden Age of Athens. Right? And there's some reason why it's been dominant for that long, don't you think?
Well, not only that, but I also don't think we should make any apologies that we're thinking from a Western mindset. I mean, we're Westerns, the United States of America. Everyone on this podcast right now is an American. it would be weird if we were approaching everything from a non-Western mindset. This is the level of absurdity we've gotten with postmodern. We're basically in revolt against logic and revolt against nature.
It is.
But I was just basically, pointing out from almost like a faux woke standpoint that, universality equals Westernism. So that's why they write poetry and they write works that are either hyper specific to them, because there's no universalizing the individual unless you're talking about something greater that we all can share, not something that's only happened to you or something that, your own take on something that happens to you, this sort of hyper real individualism. But also, oh crap, lost my train of thought. Never mind. Matt, save.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, there's a lot of great stuff you'll find in the non-Western, one of my canon. Like one of my favorite novels is actually, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer. But even Achebe, and I'm probably butchering his name. If you haven't gotten the impression by now, anyone who's listened to me for years, I'm very terrible with pronunciation. Achebe wrote his novel in English, which was considered controversial for the time because his contemporaries were like, why didn't you write this in Igbo? Why didn't you write this in an African language? Why did you write it in a colonizer language? And Achebe said, well, the novel is a uniquely the novel and the English language are inseparable. The English language birthed the novel in a sense. Wow. That's where this particular form of literary writing came from. And he said it really wouldn't make sense if I wrote this novel in Igbo because Igbo is just not a literary language in that sense. So even those who kind of try to critique the Western canon from an outsider perspective have to rely on tools developed by the West to do so.
Exactly. So they take the West to try to turn the West on itself, and they fail really because they lose all logic in the thinking process. I agree completely.
I mean, they all gravitate to Marx, who is also part of the Western canon. One that isn't exactly held in high. I imagine none of us hold in particularly high esteem. But there you go. Even the people who are trying to deconstruct society have to rely on the tools developed by that society.
I agree with you. Let me give you an example about the universal. I've actually done this in some of my classes before. I haven't done it in a while. But I would divide a class up into 4 or 5 people to a group, probably have 3 or 4 groups. When we were doing Shakespeare, doing Hamlet, by the way. And so they would all have to become one of the roles in Hamlet, right? Hamlet or Polonius or Gertrude or whatever. Take on one of the roles. And then they had to get, each together, they had to write a short 1 or 2 scene play of Hamlet and Claudius and Gertrude and Ophelia and Polonius and Laertes being interviewed on the Jerry Springer show. Okay? And I had some incredible results with that. They really loved it. But what happened many times is that it turned into comedy. So you take a tragedy, and it's been rewritten and reinterpreted from this perspective that I gave them, and many of them turned it into comedy, very successful comedy, some of it funny as it can be. But still, the whole internal universal structure of what happens in regicide, right? Or when you violate the divine order of kings and so forth, and then everyone collapses, the people collapse, the kingdom collapses. So it was all about how we look at this universal violation, and whether it's from tragedy as in the original Hamlet, or whether some of my students turn it into comedy in this case, everything still falls apart. That's a universal. That's a universal archetype. If we violate the human condition, disastrous things are going to happen. And we see that again and again and again in literature. Literature teaches that way. I mean, it's didactic in that aspect as well. So,
yeah. Now I've just got like an image of like Macduff and Macbeth choking each other out on the set of the Jerry Springer show.
Well, they love doing it. I would video it too, and we play it back in class.
not to be a smartass, but have you found if you've done that more recently with your students, have you found younger students being like, "What's the Jerry Springer show?"
I haven't done it in probably 5 or 6 years.
I was gonna say because most young students be like, "What's the Jerry Springer show?" Right?
No, right. History for all of these people now begins the day you were born, right? That's history. Okay, there's nothing before. Sort of like the Big Bang. There's nothing before it, right? All starts then and there. Everything explodes out. Boom. Here I am. I'm going to lean on the thorns of life for a while. Get real.
It's okay, Matt, if I don't know if this is like a complete U-turn, but I want to get this out because I have a terrible I've had a lot of concussions in my life and I have a bad memory. But I do think it ties into what we're talking about, universal but also personal. That in Bergman's Island, my favorite poem was actually My Tribe, because in a way that I feel like that's the one where you're speaking the most as Ralph Monday. You're speaking about yourself, this sort of lost America that you mentioned earlier that we can't go back to. Now, you don't strike me as a particularly sad guy, but when you were writing that and sort of thinking back about sort of, post World War II in the United States that, maybe that you remembered as a kid, and, my father is around, I'm assuming around your same age. My dad is going to he just turned 66, excuse me. So he often in his sadder moments, also known as when he's drinking, he'll reflect back to what it was like growing up in, small town. He moved around a lot, but so, Indiana, Pennsylvania in the 50s or 60s. And there is this sort of, deep sadness that you miss that time, not just because, we are all nostalgic. The one thing I've noticed when reading My Tribe, but also talking to people around the baby boomer age, it's a much deeper attachment to that. Like, for instance, I don't think Matt and I will ever feel the same way about the 1990s.
Okay.
Would you agree with that, Matt?
I mean, people are trying to force not use nostalgia.
It's forced. Like I don't feel it. I don't feel it. Whereas when I read your poem, My Tribe, I really do feel that you have this deep longing. If not, like, I'm not saying if you wanted a time machine, you would go back, maybe you would. But I do think you missed that time period, not only because of what it looked like, what it felt like, its aesthetics, but almost like that was a lost last gasp of everything that your poetry stands for, which is universalizing the complete acceptance that, this is a Western society, that logic matters, the Enlightenment matters. And then once that fell apart, because that's the theme we're talking about, and once that fell apart, there is no going back to that, barring some sort of great catastrophe. Do you feel that? Did you feel that when you were writing that particular poem?
Oh yeah, you got it completely about this, and maybe it is my generation. I'm just turned 65, so your dad and I are the same age, basically same generation. In that, when I look back the way that I grew up, and especially from Appalachia, because I grew up both in Tennessee and Kentucky, southeastern Kentucky, northeastern Tennessee. There was a type of cultural closeness and unity and decency in people that you just don't see on a mass scale anymore. Right? I mean, I'm not saying that everybody was an angel, because of course people weren't, but there was a type of value system that people as a whole pretty much adhered to. Like, for example, you could leave your doors unlocked. All the time. Anybody ever violate that? No, nobody ever violated it at all. Didn't happen. In middle school, we played with pocket knives on the playground at recess. Pocket knives, right? High school, you could drive up to the high school with your gun slung up in the back of your truck. Anything ever happen? Anybody ever shoot anybody? No. About the only thing you ever saw were a few fist fights, generally over some girl. And occasionally cat fights with other girls too. That was always fun to watch. So there was a type of unity of value systems, a type of unspoken honor that just doesn't, I don't think it exists anymore. And so that's part of it. And I think too, part of that poem is expressing the universal longing to return to the mythical Garden of Eden in the Western tradition that we're never ever going to return to. And so there's a melancholy there about that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I use that theme as a type of unifying feature all the way through the poem, and so it becomes not only for me at least, and I hope it becomes that way, not just my time, but a time in the past, even before my time, that was similar, that is gone now, and this type of unity that we used to have has turned into, well, it's chaos. It's Yeats' The Second Coming, turning and turning and widening God. The falcon cannot hear the falcon. The things fall apart. The things cannot hold. What rough good time come round at last, south is still Bethlehem to be born. So,
I'm a little jealous, and Matt, maybe this is a good thing that we can talk about, is that with the Boomer generation or Mr. Monday, when you talk about what you miss, everything you mention is cultural.
Right.
When people talk about what they miss from the 90s, or when I stop to think what I miss from my childhood, outside of very specific things, like I miss my neighborhood in Fairmont, West Virginia, with the small group. Outside of that, all the things that people miss, myself included, I would never take myself out of this equation, are material things. Like I miss Goosebumps. I miss shitty TV shows, Pete and Pete.
Right.
So in reality, Power Rangers.
Right. So, Pink Power Ranger, my first stirrings of manliness. All those things, I really don't miss those because they're not. I can read Goosebumps. I can watch old school Power Rangers. They still exist. So there's nothing to miss about them. Like, I don't know, maybe that goes into this difference, this disconnect. I feel like I feel nostalgic, sure, but not to the same degree that I got in that poem. I don't know if you feel the same way, Matt.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, one of the key elements of nostalgia, that nostalgia is kind of dismissed as like, oh, you're just stuck in the past, etc. But I think an important element of nostalgia that people neglect is that the nostalgia baked into it is the concept that what you're nostalgic about is just not coming back ever. And I think this is just driven to kind of tie it back into the discussion we had about technology and how it's altering people's brains and its effects on modern poetry. I think that's a crucial element of it. I got this idea from a book published in the 1960s called "Lament for a Nation: The Defeat of Canadian Nationalism" by George Grant.
Great book.
Yeah, yeah, it's a book that's not that well known in the U.S., but it's worth looking at to kind of give a basic overview. Grant was a Canadian nationalist, but his interpretation of Canada was in its original interpretation as sort of an outpost of British culture in North America that was defined Canada as a country is defined oppositionally to the U.S. They basically try to refute everything that they believe America to be, and they still do that to this day, but just in a very cartoonish way. They think Americans are obsessed with guns, so they ban guns. They think Americans are racist, so they're super welcoming to immigrants. They think Americans are homophobic and religious, so they go in the completely opposite direction. Grant talked about the conception of Canada as an outpost of British culture and how it basically died in the 1960s when John F. Kennedy successfully bullied the Canadian government into accepting nuclear-armed bombers as part of their NATO commitments. And the Prime Minister at the time, John Diefenbaker, he wasn't even necessarily opposed to the concept of accepting these bombers. He was just like, look, we're a sovereign country. You can't push us around. We have the right to reject this particular demand if we want to. Kennedy's response was to effectively aid the opposition Liberal Party to take power, who subsequently folded on everything Kennedy wanted. And kind of a side note, if any of you are familiar with Kevin Michael Grace, the live streamer and Canadian cultural critic, he asserts that Lester Pearson was a KGB agent, because it was under him that Canada became very very radically left. It was when they abandoned the Canadian ensign and adopted the maple leaf flag. It was when they became officially multicultural and officially bilingual and all that. But to circle back to my main point, Grant took the perspective that Canada going down this direction was inevitable just because of technological advances that made it easier for American culture to penetrate into Canada, that wedded the Canadian economy to the American economy, and the fact that Britain was both further away physically and was a receding power on the world stage. Hence why he called it Lament for a Nation. It was basically him saying, I don't like these things, but at the same time, to a certain extent, they were inevitable. And the Canada that I loved is just never going to come back.
That's interesting. It really is. Great.
I just looked up Lester Pearson, and the first picture is him in a bow tie, so absolutely he was a pinko commie.
Yeah.
But I think that is 100% right. And talking about this, just a thought popped into my head about why maybe there's such a generational gap that we're all talking around. But there does seem to be a gigantic gulf between boomers, millennials. Gen X, I almost feel bad for them because they kind of get forgotten in all this. When people think of Gen X, they think of grunge. That's about it. That's kind of a crappy thing to be lumped in with, although I like all that music. Is that I think why maybe, just my thought, why suicide rates among my generation and kids younger than me is so high. Many different reasons. Of course, overprescription of drugs. The fact that internet makes people schizophrenic. I mean, it really does mess with your mind. And then when you put that mind-altering substance in a phone and force people to carry around with it,
Right.
It's a complete disaster. But I think why suicide rates are so hard is because nostalgia makes everyone sad, because we all are aware we can't go back. It's one thing to be nostalgic. It's another thing to, and I no scientific study, but if you polled most people my age, early 30s, Matt and I are the same age, or a little older, a little younger, they're also not optimistic about the future.
No, they're not.
So you're sad because you can't go to the past, and you are very negative about where you're going. Like I am. So what is there to look forward to? Nothing really.
That's a really interesting perspective. In a way, that's almost like being the lost generation of the early 20th century again, in a way, isn't it? I see that point. Yeah, I can see that. And I thought it was really interesting, Ben, that when you were talking about my tribe, that you talked about the only really areas that, that you really missed weren't cultural, except for small town, hometown, so forth. And that, you missed things that were technological, think Power Rangers and so forth.
Yeah.
So to me, you weren't really expressing a loss of culture at all. You were expressing a loss of something trivial.
Absolutely.
All right, something trivial that it doesn't matter if it was lost or not. There's no true cultural connection there. Whereas I think that you're talking about my generation, that we do have this sense of loss because there was a type of unity over this entire nation. There was a type of overall unity. Were there differences? Of course there were. Always been many differences. But there was a type of American unity. And we don't have that anymore. We're all fragmented now. And you know what's really interesting too? When you talk, and I don't mean you specifically, but talking about the millennial generation and the new technology. If you think about this, and I'm going to write about this someday, World War I fragmented the Western world forever. It blew it apart. It did. It blew it apart. It blew everything apart. That's a huge part of what high modernism is about. And we're talking about people like Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises, or Eliot and The Wasteland, Prufrock, whatever it may be. It blew everything apart. It fragmented everything. Okay? That fragmentation has continued. Now, it didn't really accelerate. I think it's been a gradual process from generation to generation, but it's continued. You see it reflected now in the way that different generations process and handle information. For example, my generation was a reading generation. So everything was linear, read left to right through the page, read the whole article, read the whole book, whatever it may be. A type of linear progression through a holistic, right? Not anymore. How do most people get their information? They get it on their smartphone, right? Wake up in the morning, they check it. They go check a couple of tweets here. Then they jump over here and look what somebody's saying about breakfast on Facebook, and they look at a short clip of some athlete there. Bam, 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 bam. There's no linear progression at all. It's fragmented. So their thinking processes have become fragmented. They don't have that same type of holistic linear overview that Americans once had. I think I could argue that and show a lot of evidence to support that, because you see it right there with what people do on the phone, where they process information. It's just fragmented, totally completely fragmented. And then postmodernism comes along, and it takes those fragments and grinds them into dust. Dust obliterates them, and that's where we are.
Well, even technology, which is creates division just by its nature. I feel, not to sound like Heidegger here, but what's interesting is that the TV and the radio was promoted at a certain level, a certain uniformity, right? That's the beginning of the end of a lot of the local dialects when people started talking like
Right.
TV news anchors. The technology we're dealing with now promotes the exact opposite: total, complete atomization and fragmentation. That is a much stickier thing to put back together again, right?
Oh.
And frankly, the people that are running the show aren't interested in anything other than further fragmentation, further atomization.
Power and money.
Yes, sir.
Power and money. In some ways, it's Hunger Games, isn't it? Strangely enough.
The fact that you just mentioned that, and the fact that I'm much younger and have not even bothered to read the books or see the movies, why did I just feel like I'm one of the older guys here?
I don't know.
I haven't seen it either. I mean,
the first
garbage.
one is a good look at totalitarianism. It really is. After that, it descends into schlock Hollywood crap. It's like The Matrix. The Matrix is one of the greatest science fiction films ever made. Should have stopped right there, right? All the rest after that, to me, they're superfluous. They produce a point. I mean, the guy in The Matrix becoming Superman or whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Right.
The first one was really on target. I'll tell you something interesting. I'm sure both of you guys know who Theodore Sturgeon is, don't you?
Some of Your Blood, one of my favorite books.
Yep. Okay. Well, way back, let's see, this would have been 77, 78, 79, somewhere in that range. It was right after I got my undergraduate degree at UT. The UT English department hosted, what do they call it? Tennecon. They call it Tennessee Conference. And it was a science fiction seminar workshop for an entire week. Well, Theodore Sturgeon was a guest of honor there. He's one of the few writers that I've met personally. But I not only got to meet him personally, I was the chauffeur for him and his new young wife, Lady Jane, because he evidently had more than one wife, right? So my biggest responsibility was picking them up in the morning, and then from their hotel, and then taking them back to the hotel in the evening. But on the way back, he always had me stop at the liquor store because they would get 3 liters of red wine every night for a week. So they're drinking 3 liters of red wine a night. That's a lot. But he said something really interesting at this time, okay? He was asked, if you could predict the future, what would you say would be the biggest thing that's going to happen? And he said, and I'm paraphrasing a long time ago, but he said, someday people are going to sit at home and stare at a screen and order anything and everything they want online and get all the information that they consume online. And he was talking about the internet before it even happened. And I didn't know it. I do now in hindsight. But that's what he was talking about at that time. I think that's really fascinating. He also said that don't pay any attention to what Harlan Ellison tells you because he just lies all the time. That's what he said. They're both dead now. Ellison just died a couple of years ago, didn't he?
Yeah, he died in 2018, I think.
Yeah, a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean that's eerie. But sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So that was an experience I actually had. I still have a poster that he autographed for me somewhere rolled up around here. I need to frame it. But yeah, he's great. Great writer. Great thinker.
Damn. I mean,
You've got a short story or poems there, Ben, on your idea earlier about the Pink Power Ranger and that whole cultural thing or lack of culture, whatever it may be. You got something going on there. It's Bryden, I think, exploring.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, where did Ben go? Looks like he got disconnected. I'll wait. I'll read the questions we've got from Streamlabs. Well, I'll wait for him to come back. But yeah, it's interesting to think about. I mean, I guess I'm kind of a contrarian on this part. I mean, I'm not a gigantic fan of the. Oh, he's back. Here we go.
Yeah, sorry. I think the internet heard all the shit we were talking about it and decided that I was the easiest target and just kicked my
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a lot easier doing this on StreamYard. I used to use Streamlabs on my own YouTube channel, but it's a lot more processor intensive and a lot more, screwery like this happens. StreamYard is a lot more stable. But anyways, Ben, since you're back, I was going to. We've got a few Streamlabs tips. I was going to go through questions for Ralph and the rest of us.
Okay.
Yeah. Here we go. Greg Lansky for $1. This episode of Terror House Radio is brought to you by Blacked. Use promo code TERROR for 14.88% off your subscription. Well, I disavow that horrible comment, and I know.
No, Matt, you did you read that before?
No.
Oh, liar.
I know who sent that. He's going to get a stern talking to when
Are the initials
BP?
Maybe BP.
No, it wasn't him. I know.
Okay.
But the name does begin with B. And we have another tip from Greg Lansky for $1. Wait, it's the exact same thing. This person felt so strongly about this comment, they sent it in twice and paid twice.
Oh no, we have to protect Ralph. He doesn't need to know what's going on here.
I must say the standard disclaimer: if someone sends in a tip and pays money for it, I have to read it. I don't endorse these comments.
Oh, Matt, you whore!
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just take the money and run. Come on, let's do some boomer music. That's what Steve Miller Band. Come on, take the money and run.
Yeah, I mean, we are a profit-seeking enterprise.
It's true.
But that's it for Streamlabs tips. No one decided to ask anything more erudite. The most erudite comment we got was from Bryden, and the cheapskate didn't even pay. So,
well, I'm reading. He's saying he's refusing to give us money. So these are the type of people you hire, Matt. So, what does that say? What does it say about all of us? That we're actually listening to him.
Yeah. But anyway, we've been going on for over an hour and a half now. It's been a good conversation, but I think we should always. It's always good to end on a high note. Leave the audience wanting a little more. Before we go, first I want to urge everyone to buy Bergman's Island and other poems when it comes out tomorrow. I actually posted the pre-order link in the chat if you want to pre-order it. Because I'm feeling super nice, and because you podcast listeners are the cream de la cream of the Terror House readership, I'm going to give this to you for free. You would ordinarily have to sign up to the newsletter for this, but I'm going to give it to you for free. If you use the coupon code Rockwell to pre-order the paperback of Bergman's Island and Other Poems by Ralph Monday, you'll get a 25% discount. So I expect to see 100 orders before midnight. But yeah, it will be out tomorrow for the rest of you. Ralph, are there any other projects you're working on? I know you mentioned another poetry volume you're working on to me privately, but I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about that publicly.
Well, I have two complete collections right now that I've not released anywhere yet. Maybe you and I can someday in the future might talk about that. I have one that's called the Book of Relationships. It's broken into 3 different parts. And then I have the Book of Appalachia, which is all about Appalachia.
That one I can't wait to read. Best part of the world, in my opinion.
Yep. So mine too.
I love it. I mean, it's go back to nostalgia. The one thing about Appalachia, the old joke is that it's always 20 years behind the rest of the world, rest of the country, and by God, that's thank God it's that. Because it's a great thing. That's why I'm actually going to move back very soon, and I always take the time when I can to go and visit my grandparents because they live deep in a holla in West Virginia, and it's always good to see them. I love it. It's the best place. To just eat some ramps, get stinky, and
oh yeah,
no one really cares. I love it.
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares.
Yeah, I mean, I get a bit of that with my family back home. I'm not from Appalachia, and you can tell because I pronounce it like
son
that.
of a gun.
But my family, my dad's family is pretty rural, kind of redneck types. I'm not. I grew up in a city, but I'm one step removed from that culture, so I can definitely get the appeal. But yeah, definitely, Ralph. I'll be looking forward to your next projects. Anything you want to share with me, Ben? Anything you're working on that you want to share?
Well, you know me, man. I'm always working on something. I think I've annoyed the piss out of you and Bryden with all my the stuff I have sent you guys, so I apologize. Yeah, I mean, I'm always working on something. I got a bunch of different books under many different names, pseudonyms. My real name doesn't matter. I'm always doing something. But I just want to emphasize that everyone should buy this book, Bergman's Island. It's great. I mean, supporting poetry is really important because, there's still good novels that are being written, but there's very few good poetry that's being written, and this is one of the rare examples. So I really want people to buy this. It's great. I enjoyed reading it, even though I have, a copy of it already. I'm going to buy more. So yeah, just support, guys. Support people who write for Terror House. Support people actually doing this because, it might not seem like much. We're not, changing the culture overnight, but we are doing something positive. Support Terror House. Support, Mystery Grove. All these other publications that really are doing things. And are kind of a lonely island, if you will, in the sort of a sea of just things that suck.
Yeah,
so that's all I want to say. Buy this book. Support Ralph.
Yeah, buy our books. Buy Mystery Grove's books. Buy Expats books. Buy buy Rogue Scholars books. We're in a bit of a culture, a content renaissance, if you want to put it like that. It's really great stuff and really great authors out there. So yeah, check that out. But anyway, yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up for this show. You can find the links to you can follow Ralph on Twitter at Ralph Monday. Bergman's Island, as I said, will be coming out tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. I also have a link to Ben's website in the show notes if you want to check that out. The MP3 version of this show will be out shortly after we conclude the live broadcast. And of course, you can visit Bryden Proctor's website at brydenproctor.com. His links are in the description. And of course, my website is at mattforney.com. And that'll do it for this episode of Terror House Radio. Be sure to check in every day at terrorhousemag.com. Terror House Magazine for our latest publications. Our books are at terrorhousepress.com. You can follow our social media links in the description. And of course, you can always find the latest episodes of the show at terrorhouseradio.com. Terror House Radio is produced by Bryden Proctor. There's currently no voice-over artist or intro music. We'll be working on a solution to that soon. Illegitimate non-cover rundom. Don't let the bastards grind you down. I'm Matt Forney with Benjamin Welton and Ralph Monday, and we are out.
It's been a pleasure. Ben, I ran
awesome.